This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. I'm joined, as always, by my colleagues and co-hosts, Ben Jacob and Brian Shrader. How are you, fellas?
Doing well, Carl.
Really good, Carl. How are you this morning?
I'm good. We definitely have plenty to talk about. I know in our little pre-recording discussion, comment was made, we went from 0 to 1,000,000 miles an hour in terms of disease progression and development as we hone in on, crop conditions across the state of Indiana here for the August 14th edition of the podcast. So let's jump right into it. We've talked a number of times on the podcast in years gone by this season already about diseases like tar spot, southern rust, white mold. If I'm going to spin the wheel of where to take our conversation first, I think the arrow is going to land on tar spot. Ben, Brian, tell me, what's it look like in your neck of the woods?
I guess go ahead, Ben. You start. No, you've got a better story to tell maybe than I do.
It's probably the same kind of sad story, Brian, is that, the tar spot is kind of shocking in some areas and almost non-existent in some other areas. So the way that I've been rationalizing in my mind is just go back and look at the rainfall maps from May, and we were dry in June, but really once it turned back on in July and August, the tar spot pressure is in some ways as sporadic as the rainfall totals were through all those events. And I think that makes sense, right? Where we strung together 3, 4, 5, 6 days in a row of rainfall in various periods throughout the year, we kind of boosted that. Now it's everywhere, right? And we're getting to the point down here where a lot of our crop is made. The milk line's moving down. We're 50% milk in many cases in some of our April planted corn. So it's almost there, and it's probably holding on. And there are plenty of Memorial Day and later planted corn that's got a long way to go. And now what I'm trying to wrap my head around, Carl, since this is a new experience down here, is we've got this giant spore load from our April and early May planted corn where tar spots just running up through them. What does that do to the June planted corn next door? And my early impressions is what it does is not good. It's not good at all. So I'd be curious to get the feedback from across the state, because I may be a little bit shocked by this being my first, what I'll call a true tar spot experience. Because in years past we see it, but never really consider that we'd have to manage it. And the biggest impact I think I've probably ever seen down here is some standability concerns, but no real yield impact. And we have what I think at this point I could call an epidemic with it this year.
Okay. Well, no, good context there. And that seems to be the progression, the evolution of this disease. It moves into the neighborhood late in the year, and then it's, kind of just an anomaly, something you notice from the combine cab, hey, I'm finding some of these, black spots on my leaves, and then it's a couple years before you're back in corn, and then you have the weather to set up for, an epidemic, if you said, and oftentimes you all haven't. Same experience for me. We're just a couple years ahead in that regard. And so I'm interested in learning from Brian what his experience is on the, east central side of the state.
Well, it's very similar. I think the thing that is surprising to me is, Ben, your comment about the geography, the locale of the disease, where it's so heavy, and then you just literally drive a handful of miles north, south, east, west, and it's just a completely different pressure level. That's probably been the incredibly surprising thing to me. Now, some of that, at least right now in my geography, lines up with planting window and reproductive stage, but I don't think that that's actually the issue with why the disease is as bad as it is, I actually think it just is coincidence that the areas where the environment was most conducive, the plants were most susceptible to it. If that makes sense to everybody. I will say the same thing that you did. I think, the 0 to 1,000,000 miles an hour comment, I think, is absolutely accurate, Carl. I'm amazed at how fast this disease has blown up in some of these geographies, these pockets, if you will. Now, those pockets are pretty good size, but I'm amazed how I'm in there. You're looking at stuff I'm getting photographs from sales reps and growers of corn starting to almost melt at this point, even after a fungicide application. And that's the update that we have. I've got guys not spraying because there's no pressure. I've got guys that have sprayed the first time on some of their late planted stuff, to Ben's point. And then I've got guys who were talking about second rounds of fungicide application, which seems odd based on what you, Carl, and our other colleagues who have dealt with this, as you say, the last handful of years. It seems a little bit different, I guess, is the way I'll put that, the feel of it. But we are in that point because we're still long way from dent, and we know that yield will be impacted. It's not just going to be standability. And so this thing it feels overwhelming, Ben. I think you're right, because maybe it's new to me, but boy, trying to figure this thing out just is very different than making decisions on gray leaf spot or northern cornleaf blight. And so, I'm not going to say I'm dejected about anything. It's interesting as an agronomist, but boy, it's hard, especially given where we're at on commodity prices, to know exactly how to advise a lot of our growers on the second application specifically.
Yeah, floating around $4 corn makes it tough to pencil a second application. And I know that's part of what we get asked about is, I already went out and I made my application, and my question in return is at what growth stage? What was the calendar date? How long ago was that? Brian, you made the comment about how it almost looks like the fungicide didn't do anything. Oftentimes my experience is that we'll hit the pause button if we're able to get that fungicide on with good coverage. But it's no more than that. If you come back the next couple weeks later after that, residual activity has run its course, then you just step right back into it. You're not halting the disease, you're just pausing it for that time being. So I'm curious what the reflections are of growers at this point, if that jives, or if it was maybe too late of an application, that could be part of why we're not seeing the halting of the disease progression.
Yeah, I think at least in a couple of my geographies, I'll say one specifically, I actually think maybe it was the opposite. I think maybe we probably got too aggressive too early.
Sure.
So we sprayed earlier perhaps than what we should have. Again, all for the right reasons. New disease, we understand that tar spot can take a lot off the top really quickly. And so I think maybe we got a little aggressive, perhaps too early. I think our fungicides worked and held things back. We talk about that latent period a lot. And so you're going to have some infection that came in. You've got spots that look like they weren't there. The infection had started. I think we halted those, but I think the pressure is so great and the environment has been so conducive for a good chunk of my geography. The fungicides did what they said, but I also think that some of the unsubstantiated claims about how long fungicides will actually last on corn plants, I think we have proven some of those false. I think that reading your label, and when many of the labels say reapply in, what is it? I think 21 days, 2 weeks to 21 days, whatever those labels read. That's a legitimate statement, but that flex is there because of environmental conditions. And I think, again, some of these claims that are made about how long these fungicides will stay intact, we've learned that we are pushing those bounds, I think, is probably the most polite and politically correct way to say that.
What's put on marketing publications are very different than what is, the legal label that, that's actually in place. And so, sometimes you can get those two things conflated. So just to unpack that a little bit further, Brian, you said that, the alerts were out. We were cognizant of tar spot being in the neighborhood. That prompted some folks to take aggressive management. And like you said, you got 2-3 weeks times worth of activity out of the fungicide. If you do that before the disease has really started to set in and develop, you can be on the early side. Other questions that I would assume are going through growers' heads as they listen to this is, well, y'all said you found it like a month or 3 weeks earlier than ever before in the state of Indiana. Why is it just showing up now? And tar spot can be very aggressive. In 2021, we saw in my neck of the woods, it took down fields in a matter of 2 weeks. It looked like not a whole lot happening from the road to, oh my word, my cornfield is dead. So maybe that's something that we could unpack a little bit. Why we said we've got tar spot. It didn't really do anything. It didn't kill the plant in 2 weeks back in June. What gives? Why are we seeing things the way we are now?
Yeah, two things I will say is, one, that for me personally, you've got tar spot, it looks pretty bad. We may need to think about doing something to, oh my word, this is a mess. The only thing I can relate that to is a handful of years ago in my Western geography, in a former territory that I covered. So very close to US 31. That way, it would actually be Kyle Quick, our colleague who was on the podcast last week, his geography now. I recall looking at fields on a Monday and going back to the same geography on Wednesday during a northern corn leaf blight outbreak. Yep. And on Monday, we were like, hey, we need to spray. And on Wednesday afternoon, it was like, oh, we're too late. And that's the same kind of level of urgency I feel in terms of this tar spot. I also think that the learning for me personally has been that while we have a temperature regime for tar spot, I actually think the 10 hours of leaf wetness is far more important than what the temperature is. I think that, again, we're all learning, including Dr. Talenko and many other extension specialists. But in my observations, I actually think the leaf wetness is much more important than the temperature. And I think that that's the difference between why we saw what we thought was a slow development and then a ramp up, is because the humidity and the leaf wetness length of the duration has changed. It's ebbed and flowed. And so I think the disease progression has ebbed and flowed, at least in my geography. I can't speak to your geography or Ben's, but based on my observations, that's sure what I think I'm seeing.
Yeah, Brian, I would agree with the leaf moisture comment. I think that's key. And, if you look at the tar spot map on the IPM pipe, I think you can rationalize that a little bit because, if the temperature, that cool temperature was so important to spreading, you would not see it in southern Florida where they have some counties lit up where, it's never below 85 degrees. So I think we can rationalize that for sure. The other comment I would make about the buildup is that, tar spot appears to me like it has a logarithmic buildup, like it's a slow burn early. Now, part of that is, in my opinion, it's just so darn difficult to scout for. You're not looking. It's different than these big lesions that we're seeing, that we're used to seeing rather from gray or from northern. Like those that our eyes are calibrated for. Tar spot's a little bit of a new look, and this year, I attributed it or associated it with kind of my same experience and same mushroom hunting. Once you find the first one, you see them everywhere. And tar spots.
Yes.
Once I see the first one, my eyes are open to a whole new world now. But the other thing is, there is a delay between that initial infection and the time when that spot shows up. Right. So I think that's part of what we're seeing when say that the fungicide didn't appear to work. To back up just a second, is that I think it's important maybe to take a minute to go over real quick what fungicides actually do. Right. So we really have three modes of action, right? That we'll apply foliar. We have probably most common strobilurins and triazoles. And then there are some mixes now with the SDHI in it. Right. So our product, Approach Prima, strobilurin, and triazole. Right. So there are no truly curative fungicides is the reason that I bring this up, because we think often that, that triazole has curative activity. And it does in the sense that it stops the further development of the mycelium within the leaf, but it does not stop the sporulation from an infection that's already occurred. Okay, so that infection still builds and it produces spores. And guess what? The timeline on that is probably pretty close to when your fungicide is going to break anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right?
well
So
said.
the delay is very real on that. The strobilurin and SDHIs are both strictly preventative, right? They can prevent that spore that lands on the leaf from germinating and prevent it from penetrating the leaf tissue. So that's a lot. That's a lot to go through to say that. Yes, Brian, it is shocking, I think, when we see that, oh, this fungicide did not do as much as what I thought visually. But we were behind the 8 ball on some of them too, right? We
Yeah,
were
that's
definitely
fair.
late, and we're looking at probably 3 to 5% already on the ear leaf. And that's what we can see the day that we spray. There are additional infections that we are not going to stop with that fungicide application that have already
Yeah.
taken place. So when you go back out there, the other thing I'd say too about applications is you can see, or I can see in some of my heavier areas where we had really good coverage and then where we had poor coverage. And sometimes they're in the same field. Often they are. We've got a lot of trees, the
Mm-hmm.
the plane gets higher towards the end of the field. So you can see visually out in the field how good your coverage is. And the last thing I'll say, I know you guys up north have rung this bell quite a bit for the years. I would love, with my background coming from research, I would love to say we planned it this way. But tar spot just hasn't been around long enough. But there is very, very clear separation between our genetics and what's coming out of Germany in the tar spot tolerance. That is very real, even in the fuller season genetics. That's not to say that ours are impenetrable. They're still going to benefit from a fungicide in these heavier areas, and there is separation, kind of across our lineup. But that difference between us and the Germans is very, very real.
Ben, to that point, I've had a lot of folks over the last week or 10 days that have said, hey, why isn't the tolerance better in not just our products, but everything else? And I was quick to remind folks, and it took me a minute to think through this, but based on the actual development or the arrival time of tar spot, I think it's important to point out to folks that if you use our typical 5 to 7 year timeline that we talk about with hybrid development, and I know under certain circumstances as a company, we're able to do that a little bit quicker. But if you think about that, the potential to have a hybrid that is in a Pioneer bag that has been developed across its entire lifetime under pressure from tar spot for evaluation is actually probably, if not zero, very close. And so we aren't even through one breeding cycle yet of developing new products with tar spot being a disease. Most of the tools that we use are observational on the part of our product agronomists and our researchers looking at product and evaluating them. Until this year, most of the tar spot pressure has been in northern latitudes. So a number of the products that you and your colleagues to the south would be using might not even been under mid-season, if you will, pressure from tar spot. And so we're getting better incrementally. Give us a little time. Let us get through a breeding cycle or two, and those natural in-plant tolerance levels will increase. But I do agree there are definitely genetic separations. Now, that isn't to say that we are immune, to your point, but I do think that give us a little time. Our breeders are making strides, but we're very early into product development under tar spot pressure.
I think that statement, Brian, is not one that we just hold as a genetics provider, but as you look at, Dr. Talenko's work, as she lists out her top 5 things to manage for tar spot, number 1 is hybrid selection. And that's in recognition of there's a vast canyon between what she would characterize as tolerant hybrids, those that seem to be able to ward off tar spot, not completely, immune to your point, but those that seem to fare decent without a fungicide application. Maybe they'd be better off with the fungicide application. We'd probably all assume that. But then those that are highly susceptible, and there is just that significant difference across the industry from a germplasm standpoint. Now, Ben, one thing that Brian touched on there was, product development and the challenge there. You can probably comment from your research background, but when it comes to us screening hybrids for northern corn leaf blight or gray leaf spot, we have different tools that we can use to ensure that we have consistent evaluations across the whole pipeline, because we can actually artificially inoculate all of the plants with those diseases. That's not something we have available for us with tar spot at this time.
Right. Yeah. And actually, we had it. We had when I was still in research. I'm not sure that it still exists at this point, but we've had for many years a northern corn leaf blight screening in Windfall in northern Indiana, and so yeah, it is. You can put pressure on that. And the other thing at this point, for those more traditional diseases, we'll call them, we have some markers developed to identify areas of the genome that confer more tolerance, right? So you can select that out as just part of your breeding process early on. That when you're looking through your marker data, like this is my threshold for northern, for gray, and
Yep.
we'll only let those through the pipe, and then we'll see how it develops out in the field by putting that artificial pressure on it. And in some cases, we'll definitely encounter some real pressure out there too. So yeah, that's all, but that's a system that's developed over, well, almost 100 years at this point. And to Brian's point, we've got maybe one breeding cycle, 7 years of tar spot, and we don't have those things in place to put that artificial pressure on it. And truth be told, I think we're still, as an ag community, that we say, still figuring this thing out and what the conditions are that really pushes it hard. And like I said, I agree with Brian that leaf moisture is key, but getting those environments manipulated where you're going to see pressure in your breeding pipeline year in and year out is tough to do if you're not sure what that exact environment is, right? So
That's right.
it's a work in
That's right.
progress, but I think we're probably close to having that as just being a standard portion of our breeding pipeline. So
Yeah, more time to come on that front, but no, it's something that's definitely in the works. Well, and not to chase too much of a squirrel because I want to keep it tight on tar spot, but we'll pursue it anyway. There's a product concept that's out there in the public that we've started talking about within Pioneer, and Brian, Ben, you might have a better idea of how this is, what's it's named right now, but isn't it like a multi-disease something or other? And the idea is that we're stacking all of these different genetic sources of tolerance to, 4 key diseases. Could you maybe speak to what the actual name is that we're calling it here, so that folks don't call it whatever I just tried to dub it?
yeah, I think the official name right now is the disease or disease multiple disease tolerance, multi-disease tolerance, something like that. Its original name was the one that should have stuck. Originally, it was called the disease super locus, and
Yep, like it.
that's the one that I prefer. So, but yeah, the idea is that so we have identified all these areas that of the maize genome, and like this region of the genome is associated with good northern tolerance or gray or
Hmm.
whatever. So
Right.
the dumbed down version of it that I can understand is that we've taken all these and smashed them together into one spot, one loci on a chromosome. So it's really easy to select for and really easy to keep all those packaged together when you're making crosses. So again, this is something that's still in the future. We don't have it in products currently, but will in short order. But yeah, you get all your good DNA smashed together in one spot, so it's easy to select for and easy to transfer through the breeding cycle. And it makes the breeder's job just that much simple because they don't have to screen for that or screen for individual little segments that are trying. They can shift their focus to other things and know that they're imparting a minimum level of disease tolerance to
Yep.
to that hybrid.
No, well stated. Bringing us back to the tar spot development, we kind of talked about all of a sudden it just blows up out of nowhere, and your comment about leaf wetness and the challenge of scouting for it. My experience has been under normal conditions. You find that very first stroma, the one black fleck of tar there, and then maybe you come back a week or two later and you've got 1% of the leaves that are covered. There's 1% coverage on the lower leaves in the canopy. And again, if you're not out there, if you've gone out on a fishing trip or you've been in the sprayer and you haven't been looking down low, then all of a sudden you come back and now we've got, maybe it's 1% up by the ear leaf. And then the next time it's 5% at the ear leaf. And now we're at this threshold, that 1 to 5, where it's like, if we don't do something right now, it's likely too late. And as soon as you get to 35% coverage, which is kind of that next iteration, you talked about the logarithmic curve, that exponential curve of disease development. That's kind of what it looks like. All of a sudden, 1 turns into 1%, 1% turns into 5 turns into 35. At 35, that leaf is literally dead. It's the plumbing's too clogged up. It's not going to transfer photosynthates back to the ear. So that's the challenge, is unless you catch it from being really hard to find at that 1-ish% to where it's easy to find at 5, and then after that 35 is dead, you don't have much time to find and scout for this disease, pull the trigger on getting a fungicide application, get good coverage, because again, to your point, this latent period that Shrader had mentioned, you might not see the sporulation that took place, but know if you have black stroma on the leaves, they've already begun to shoot the next generation of spores out there that have landed on the leaves. So unless you interrupt that cycle due to conditions with poor leaf wetness, a drier type of environment, or with a fungicide application, to prevent, like you said, the actual mycelium making the infection within the leaf tissue. That's the challenge. That's what makes tar spot so hard to manage, because unless you're a really astute scout and a well-timed application, you're just going to find yourself in this 0 to 1,000,000 miles an hour type of situation.
I mean, maybe one last thing on tar spot and the fungicide applications. I also think that even with the commodity market, there were a lot of kind of prophylactic fungicide applications made, and it looked like we were going to have some heavy disease pressure early. I get that a lot of times the plain is the best option, but I think you need to understand that with that low carrier volume, for sure, and the height above the canopy, that you are giving up some coverage compared to, say, a ground rig.
Sure.
But I think more importantly, you're giving up canopy penetration, and most fungicides, or really all fungicides, do not move well down the plant. They'll move within a leaf, okay,
right,
but they don't down the leaves, or down the plant rather. So if you don't get coverage on a leaf, you're not going to stop it in there. So if you think about back through your description of how tar spot develops, even if you sprayed a fungicide 2 or 3 weeks ago on a green tassel, you probably didn't stop that disease progression. You may have protected the ear leaf and up in that canopy, but you didn't stop the disease progression. So it's still building in the lower canopy. And when that fungicide breaks, you do have that heavy spore load, right? And so I think that's also why sometimes you can feel like we got behind this, and man, we sprayed a fungicide and it still just came out of nowhere. Well, yeah, we sprayed a fungicide. We got the protective window out of it, right? But we didn't stop the disease that was building up in the lower canopy. And then when the fungicide broke, it just pushed up what seemed like ridiculously fast. But I think it's logical with the way that a fungicide works and the amount of coverage and penetration into the canopy we're probably getting.
It reaffirms what we understand about the disease. Grateful to know that we've got our heads screwed on straight, because for the last month we've been saying, my word, we've got great conditions for disease development here. Where is it? and it's finally started to rear its head. We've got that accumulated leaf wetness. That's just the prime environment for the opportunity for spores to make that infection. One thing that we haven't paid off yet, Ben, is this idea of when is it too late to make an application? The comment that you'd made before was about, well, in years past, we've seen impact on harvest standability. $4 corn and $20 product, $30-$40 product application, depending on what you're using for fungicide. All of a sudden that hurdle rate's somewhere around that 5 to 10 to 15 bushels. I can say up north we've seen plenty of instances where a no spray was 40 bushels to the worse, and what got sprayed was we preserved that that yield potential. But even then, making a late application, the opportunity for impact lessens and lessens, because you've got all of the disease development that's already taken place, and what you can't see is what's going to take place in the next 2 weeks because that spore load. So it's what's left to protect. That's the game that you're playing. So my anecdotal experience has been, if you do something at early dent, might not pencil in terms of bushels, but from a harvest standability perspective, if you got a lot of acres to crawl over with a combine, just having upright corn can definitely be worth that money, despite it not being bushels in the grain tank, but efficiency from a harvest operation standpoint. Those are from my perspective, not one and the same, but both need to be accounted for. If you were to look at suggestions from the extension specialists and the crop protection network, they'd suggest R4, you still got a good chance. I shouldn't say a good chance. You still have a chance under severe disease pressure to get a positive ROI. After that, they're usually not advocating for an application. And same concept, if you made an application at, call it brown silk, they're figuring is that that's a later quote unquote application, and so therefore you probably shouldn't need that second application of fungicide. Again, since you can't trust your own experience, if this is your first go around as a grower, this is when you can lean on folks like Ben, Brian, your local field agronomist. And if they're scratching their head because you got a really tough situation, that's where they can lean on other folks with a greater track record of expertise here. Every field's different, every year's different. I mean, you can tell based on the tenor of our conversation, this is an important matter that we don't have it all figured out, but we're sure doing our darndest here to protect those bushels.
Yeah, and I think that based on my understanding and the conversations that I've had, like this is probably, I have to think on it for a minute, but I am pretty confident this is the first year that I've actually recommended a fungicide specifically for tar spot. So that's an interesting milestone, I guess, to get to. but we've been using R4 kind of as a cutoff, but there's a caveat with that. It's at R4 if we're seeing 1 to 3%
Sure.
stroma on the ear leaf. That's when I say this is, in my mind, a definite spray, right? That we need to get this under control. Now that also is tied back into the forecast that we've had at the time, where, like you mentioned moments ago, that it looks like we're going to be conducive for spread, right? Disease progression. So yeah, I've been using that R4 number. In some situations, could we push it back to dent? Yeah, likely, but I still struggle with the whole idea that if in those situations we're likely already seeing something that's at more than that 3 or 4% on the leaf, that's why we're considering, because this is a lot further along than what we expected. But the struggle I have is that we're seeing that 3 to 4%. What's actually in the leaf at that point? Is that 20%? I don't, we don't know. But I can say that in a lot of cases where we've made those late applications this year, you can go out in the field and say, man, we didn't stop it. We may have slowed it down, and maybe we do gain a little bit of standability, but it's like, boy, that is tough to look at. To look at the field for sure. So again, you can see coverage differences as well, but it's dynamic. and that's what we've been saying all year, is that the fungicide decisions this year are going to be dynamic, and they've been very dynamic, and the market pressure doesn't help at all. These
Right.
conversations are much different if the corn market's stronger. So it's just a lot of things coming together to make for some really tough decisions this year.
Certainly. One resource folks can use, if you go to cropprotectionnetwork.org/fungicide-ROI-calculator, that is one place that you can leverage, cost of different fungicide products, your market price for your grain, and then likeliness of, having that getting you back in the black type of situation. Just because you got tar spot doesn't necessarily mean that the house is burning down, but throwing good money after bad, if the house is aflame, is it worth going ahead and trying to take it out with the fire extinguisher? Or are you better off saving that for, the next go round? That's kind of the concept here on if you're past that 5% at the ear leaf, or, even beyond that, you see it at dent stage and you say, oh boy, I've got a lot out there. You can go ahead and spend the money, but is it going to have the impact based on Ben's comment about how much is actually in the leaf that we can't see yet? That's the challenge, and that's what makes it tough to walk away from a field and not take action. So a lot of that research, Ben, here 5 years ago when we weren't talking tar spot hot and heavy, was based on aggressive diseases like southern rust. Give us the update from down in the south. What does it look like on the southern rust front?
Yeah, so I saw on Hoosier Ag today that Darcy had been interviewed, Dr. Darcy Talinka out of Purdue, and she mentioned that there were 4 counties with southern rust, and I really should probably send her some leaf samples, because we could light up the entirety of my area and likely north. I'm going to guess that we could probably find it near Purdue's campus at this point, with just crack a barrel and what I'm finding down here. Now, I can find it in almost every field, kind of regardless of a fungicide application or not. And when that application was made, it still seems to be there in the lower canopy, which makes me think that maybe it was here before barrel came through.
Okay.
In some places, it was in Daviess County, Kentucky, right on the Ohio border. And I'm sure those earlier storms before barrel, I know that everybody's got a short memory, but we watched a ton of storms just move south to north, with very, very little west to east movement at all, it seemed like. And they came up kind of the west side of the state. So I really do believe that probably north for me, you can still find it from some of those earlier storms that were bringing through, as they were coming through 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes dropping spores. So it's there. I think it's wider spread than what we probably realize. Now, the positive side, I guess, of that, if there is a positive side, is that in the past, sometimes when we've had those consistent storms come through, we almost just get blanketed with it. And that's not what we're seeing in the field this year. It's almost like you can see ground zero where the first spore dropped in the field, and you'll have a hot spot on 2 or 3 plants. And then if you go out from that in like concentric circles, like a bullseye, you may have another 30 feet on either side of it where you can find an individual spore, building out from that. Now, southern rust is incredibly aggressive, especially if you have the humidity and heat to push it. Now we haven't necessarily been having the heat, but we've had the humidity, and it's kind of an interesting argument I'm having in my brain, I guess, is that it's almost like we're humid and hot enough during the day to move southern rust, and then we cool off and get wet at night. Push the tar spot, and so it's kind of this macabre race going on in some places as to what's going to kill the crop first. Is it going to be the southern rust, or is it going to be the tar spot? And neither one of them are good, right? But the tar spot is more widespread. Southern rust kind of in these pockets, but it moves quick enough that it'll build up in a hurry. So
Man, I've got a question
But
for you in regards to, Southern Rust and Tar Spot. You say you got both of them. You even sent some pictures where you can find it on the same leaf, and that's an awful spot to be as a grower, where you're, warding off two of the most virulent pathogens known to corn. I know in my scouting last week, I was going through a plot and you know, for whatever this is worth, you're hearing from a Pioneer agronomist, couldn't find any tar spot. We were looking really hard in the Pioneer corn. We had the 1 DeKalb entry in order to keep ourselves honest. That was the one where I could find it. It wasn't in a spray situation, but we're finding that early infection. Same story this year when we're looking for the earliest infections in an area, corn on corn ground, Heritage Monsanto genetics, just because there does seem to be a weaker predisposition on their front versus what we have in that late season plant health advantage. So doesn't mean anybody's immune, but we are finding that genetic separation. Darcy's confirmed that, within her own extension talks. What's the differentiation look like on Southern Rust and the genetic ability to see separation there? Is there that separation? There is, but it's less than tar spot. Is it more like gray or northern? Tell us, what does it look like from a management standpoint, speaking from the genetics perspective?
Yeah, so there is some separation in genetic tolerance to Southern Rust. Now, it is not nearly as wide as it is in tar spot, and the correct way to say that's probably it's just not as good.
Sure.
And maybe Southern Rust is such an aggressive pathogen, and you think about that time from infection to sporulation. Tar spot, what's the window that gets thrown out? 14 to 21 days, I think.
Yeah, you got it. Yep.
And Southern Rust, depending on what article you read, that can be as short as 5 days.
Yeah.
So you think about cutting that down by a third or more, that cycle time to where we're building spore load. It's just very, very aggressive in how it reproduces. And it doesn't need that free leaf moisture. It'll do just fine with high humidity. And if anybody's been walking corn over the past month, guess what happens in the corn canopy? And I don't care what the relative humidity is out in with the air moving inside that canopy. We're gonna have a lot of humidity. So yeah, it puts tremendous pressure on the crop. Now there is some separation. I would love to sit here, Carl, and be able to tell you that yes, there's a clear line company to company from genetic pools. That's just not the case. We do see, if you remember back, I don't know if it would have, some folks listening to this will remember it. 1498 was a product that we had for around forever, and a real kind of durable, stable product for us down here. And that thing was a Southern Rust magnet. Like
interesting.
It clearly sorted out the bottom as this thing. It's drawn to it. It spreads rapidly, and there are a few products like that over time that stand out. But it's been a long time since we've had Southern Rust pressure kind of this early, and it's been a real long time since we've had that coupled with a bunch of June planted corn. So we've turned over so much in our lineup that a lot of most of what we're planting at this point has probably not seen, at least in southern Indiana, has probably not seen Southern Rust pressure in a commercial field like it is seen this year. So sure. I guess my point in bringing that up is I don't really know. We do have Southern Rust scores in our books though, but what with how everybody's turned over their lineup. So this is kind of a new experience to say, hey,
sure.
These new different genetic pools, how do they sort out, when we do have this pressure on them? So
right.
there will be some interesting observations to come around that, I'm sure. But it's just honestly, 2016 was the real heavy Southern Rust year. I mean, we've had some pockets since then, but you think about the changes from 2016 to 2024 in terms of genetics, especially coming from us. That's
very few holdovers from that time.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Yeah. Still have the institutional knowledge on the germplasm, but for our own experience, local applied experience. That's what's lacking here. Nope, that's fair. And appreciate you sharing that. Yes, there could be some genetic separation, but this is just one that's such an overwhelming disease based on its polycyclic nature that's going to be the difference here. Is just, can you manage it with enough growing season to go where you can impact the management, but also not have so much growing season to go that whatever you throw at it, it's still going to succumb to that, to that disease pressure at some point. Ben, we talked a lot on corn so far today. Last week, Brian had a nice discussion with Kyle and Jason on red crown rot and soybeans. I can say in my area, the calls have finally started coming in on white mold. Last week was the first week that we're talking white mold. If you give me a little bit of birth here, my theory is that white mold, you see the presentation of the fuzzy white stems, but if I recall correctly from a Nebraskan pathologist, that you can have the clogging up of the vascular tissue a couple of weeks ahead of time with the sclerosis developed inside there. And so if you think about how long it takes to develop, the challenge in the vascular tissue, that's probably another couple of weeks removed. So that's right in line with when we're experiencing the heaviest, the most severe precipitation events of the year for my area, being the hurricane and then the derecho. So with those last set of blooms that we had, up towards the top of the canopy, perhaps we had enough splashing from those driving rains that we could have, let the apothecia release the spores, the little mushrooms that are down there for white mold growers. And that's where we were able to create the infection site, but it would align with that, that later bloom period, or if we had enough rubbing of the stems through, them getting whipped around in the winds of the remnants of a hurricane or the derecho coming through. It takes a wound site for white mold to get in. So we talked about beans blooming 2-3 weeks earlier this year than they had the previous growing season, and maybe that was getting us out of the window of vulnerability for white mold development. It seems as though we did not escape that, and it's not everywhere by any stretch. We're talking about finding the first plants in the first fields in the first areas of the state, but I know the northern latitudes, Brian could confirm this, that they're also finding their first batches of white mold. So I don't think it's going to be a 2023 white mold year, but buckle up because it's not as though we escaped it in 2024.
Yeah, that's a good call out. And I think we're seeing, obviously Jason and Kyle on, and they probably touched on this, but we're seeing SDS show up and some brown stem rot show up, and obviously there's some red crown rot out and about. I still have yet to find red crown rot, and I'm not upset about that. As I think back, there's some situations in years past where maybe because we had some SDS pressure there for a couple of years, it just did not make sense. But yeah, thankfully that white mold situation, I don't have to deal with it year in and year out just yet. There is a small pocket over on my east side that randomly has white mold for some reason that I still don't understand. Maybe it's an equipment quarantine situation. I don't know. But
Sure.
There is a pocket where we deal with it most years. But I do want to back up and take just a second to talk through fungicide decision making on southern rust.
Yes.
Because I think we omitted that when we were there, and it's important. So the easy decision to make, the one that most people, the emotional decision, is that, oh crap, we got southern rust, we have to spray now. And that's not the case. Right? There's a little bit more nuance to it than that. So a lot of this crop's just simply too far along to see a response.
Yep.
If it's moving aggressively and we have heavy pressure, you can see a yield response, an actual yield response, and positive over the positive economic response. Paying for the application and making money through 50% milk. We don't have the
That's wild. Yeah.
This year that are going to move it quite that aggressively, but it is still, like I said, very aggressively. So where I'm at is I'm still using dent as a cutoff.
Sure.
If the weather happened to change, if we had more heat to go along with the moisture, that would be a little bit of a different story. But yeah, so we use dent as a cutoff, and for for like the disease pressure, honestly, it's 25 to 30% of the plants. If I can find any southern rust, it's time. It's time. It doesn't matter where it is on the plant. It's time to make that application. And so, but within that, there's also some corn that's on the early side, and you can find southern rust in those fields, like just one little spot, maybe two. And so this is maybe R2 corn still, and the temptation is to say we've got to go spray that right now. And I don't think that's always the case. Like you talked about brown silk earlier, pushing that back. Like if you spray it now, you run the risk of really, really needing to spray it a second time, as you're mentioned how the coverage from fungicide, you're still going to have that spore load in the lower canopy. And if your neighbor doesn't spray, you're going to have a tremendous spore load. And it doesn't, southern rust is a very small spore that travels a long way in the wind and the storm systems. Obviously, it blows in from the Gulf every year.
Sure.
Whereas tar spot's a relatively large spore, right? And it's not that it won't move with the wind, but it's not moving across the continent with the wind.
Yes.
Quite southern rust is, right? So, but the point is that there's a heavy spore load build up for southern rust in the area already, and it's coming in from all over the country, likely. So the timing of that application is absolutely critical. And if you do that, we've talked about this so many times this year already, and with tar spot being the reference point. But if you do that too early, you're just not going to get the mileage out of it, and you still leave yourself open. So, but you have to be honest with yourself about the pressure, because tar spot is so aggressive, or southern rust rather, is so aggressive, right? So, if you have it, 25 or 30% of the plants out there, I would go stop it. And maybe you could make the argument that depending on how severe those pockets are, because that's how we're finding it. Like I mentioned, just little pockets, these bullseye shapes. Depending on how big the center of that bullseye is the way to think about it. Maybe you do need to be more aggressive about that on the number of plants that actually have it. So it's dynamic. But it's not the end of the world, and it's not we've got to spray everything right now, right? We need to. This is a nuanced decision, and have the conversation to make the right decision, because nobody wants to pay for a fungicide and not get the benefit out of it, right? That's a really, really kind of expensive investment to just miss completely. So unfortunately, it takes the miles to make the right decision, to understand what the pressure truly is, and to get the most out of that application.
What I had heard from our conversation, if you're at 5% or less at the ear leaf on tar spot, you may still have time. If you're more than that, you're going to be in a bad way. 25% of the plants having southern rust, not having 25% of the leaves on a plant having southern rust, or 25% of a leaf surface being covered by southern rust, but just if you go out there and you count 20 plants, if you got 5 of them there that actually have, some of the rust on them, boom, that's where we're starting to talk about the idea of it's probably time to go ahead and consider an application. So just for folks as they're making their scouting and trying to do some assessments there. But good conversation today, Ben. I know there was a sense of urgency when we hopped online just based on disease development. So if you catch this 2 weeks in the future, heavens, get back out there, jump in your time machine, do whatever it takes. But as anything this time of year, the more that you spend in your fields, the more likely you are to set yourself up for success and defending this crop against the things that are trying to take those bushels away before harvest.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Well, hey, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this edition of the Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. Ben, if folks want to follow along with you on Facebook or X, where can they search for you and get there?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy, and on X occasionally at the Ben Jacob. How about you, Carl?
Perfect. And see me reposting a lot of Ben's great content on X at Joern, that's CJOERN, or on Facebook at Joern Agronomy. And with that, we thank you for listening to this edition of the Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. If you'd be so kind to give us a rating and a review to help other folks find us, we'd always appreciate that. Hit the subscribe button if this is your first go around with us. But thanks to all of you that have been listening for a long time in Pioneer Listening Land. And we look forward to a conversation with you on the other ends of these microphones next week, or perhaps seeing you live at a field day in the coming weeks. So until next time, be safe, and we'll talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.